Warning, extremely disturbing material is discussed. Warning, grooming and CSA are discussed. Warning, PNES dissociative episode is portrayed. Once Susie regained control of the wheel, she immediately pulled over to the side of the road. She slammed the car into park and sat there, both hands gripping the steering wheel as she gasped for air. Her heart was pounding violently against her chest, adrenaline surging through her veins. For a terrifying second, she had been certain she was going to lose control completely and run the car straight off the road. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice trembling. She closed her eyes and took several shaky breaths, trying to steady herself. Her hands were still trembling so badly that she had to loosen her grip on the steering wheel. "I thought I was going to crash," she finally managed to say, still breathless. "I thought I was going to run us right off the road." She glanced at Tate again. He was still holding the invisible presence steady in front of him. His face wasn't aggressive. It wasn't chaotic anymore. It was focused. Careful. Like responsibility had been assigned to him in a reality only he could see. Susie swallowed hard. "Tate thinks he's helping someone," she added quietly, "but there's no one else in the car." The dispatcher responded immediately, asking for confirmation of location and advising her to remain still until EMTs arrived. Susie nodded even though they couldn't see her. "Yes, we're staying put." She set the phone down on speaker again and leaned back slightly, keeping her eyes on Tate. Moments stretched. Then more. Tate shifted slightly in his seat again, adjusting his hands as if repositioning whoever he believed was there. "It's okay," he murmured again, "we're almost home." His voice softened further. "Promise me you won't fall asleep again," he added like praise. "Just stay awake, you mustn't fall asleep, Noah." "Noah," Susie gasped. Teach had been hallucinating that he was helping Noah, maybe in the past, or maybe it was a dream she didn't know. Susie's chest tightened, not with fear now, but with something more complicated. Confusion, concern, and the very real realization that whatever was happening in his mind had fully replaced the road around him. And then finally, flashing lights appeared in the rearview mirror. Susie exhaled sharply. "Help is here," she said softly, mostly to herself. Tate didn't react to that. He was still looking forward, still carefully holding his invisible passenger in place, still anchored in a world that wasn't sharing space with hers. When EMTs arrived, Susie was the one who stepped out first, hands raised, voice shaking, trying to explain what she had just witnessed in a way that would make sense to someone trained to understand it. And behind her, Tate remained in the truck, quiet, focused, and somewhere else entirely. Susie barely made it inside before she broke down. The hospital parking lot was still damp from the drizzle, headlights reflecting in soft, broken streaks across the pavement. Inside, everything smelled faintly of antiseptic and burnt coffee, too clean for how messy everything felt. She found Andrew near the entrance. The second she saw him, whatever control she'd been holding onto cracked. She didn't even say hello. She just stepped forward and collapsed into his chest, shaking. "It happened again," she said, voice breaking. "It happened while I was driving him home. He wasn't there, Andrew. He wasn't with me." Andrew immediately wrapped an arm around her, steadying her without rushing her to speak faster. "Hey," he said quietly, "slow down, you're safe. What happened?" Susie tried to breathe, but it came out uneven. "He reached for the wheel," she said. "Like he thought something was happening in the car. He kept talking to someone, like someone was right next to him. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking at space and responding to it like it was real." Andrew's expression tightened slightly, but not in shock, more like recognition forming into concern. Susie continued, wiping her face quickly. "And it wasn't random, it was focused, like he was responsible for keeping someone safe, like he was actively in it. I tried to ground him, but he wasn't fully coming back." Andrew held her steady as she spoke, then nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, "okay, I understand." Susie pulled back just enough to look at him. "He almost caused another incident on the road. I had to stop the car. Andrew, I thought we were going to." "You did the right thing pulling over," Andrew said firmly. "You kept him safe, you kept yourself safe." That steadied her slightly, but not fully. Her voice dropped. He was talking like he was taking care of someone, like he was protecting them, and I swear to God it sounded like it was Noah to him. That made Andrew pause. Not surprised exactly. Just thoughtful. He exhaled slowly. Dissociation can pull in memory fragments, he said carefully. Especially under stress, it can feel real, it can feel present, but it's not happening in the external world the way he's experiencing it. Susie nodded weakly. It looked real to him. I know, Andrew said gently, but we have to be careful not to treat what he's experiencing as literal reality. It's his mind trying to organize distress. Susie wiped her face again, swallowing hard. What do we do? She asked. Andrew looked toward the doors where EMTs had taken Tate earlier. We stabilize him, he said, and we stop the cycle of stress feeding it. 1 week later, Tate was sitting outside his house a few doors down from Noah's Rambler. Andrew approached him, noticing that Tate seemed better than he had been the week before. Susie stayed nearby but let Andrew take the lead. Andrew approached slowly, not crowding him. Hey Tate, he said calmly, it's Andrew. Tate looked at him for a moment, then nodded faintly. Andrew pulled up a second chair, sitting at a respectful distance. You've had a rough couple of days, Andrew said. Tate didn't respond. Andrew kept his tone steady. We're not here to push you, we just want to understand how you're doing right now. A pause. Then Andrew asked gently, would it help if we went somewhere quieter, maybe sit in Susie's pickup where it's familiar and just talk for a bit? No pressure, just you, me, Susie, and Noah. Tate's eyes shifted slightly. Not fully present but not gone either. Andrew continued carefully, you don't have to explain anything you can't, we're just trying to bring you back into something steady. Another pause. Then softly, can you do that? Susie watched from the doorway, hands clenched together, hoping this time the world would stay still long enough for him to hold on to it. Tate sat in the car with the kind of stillness that wasn't quite rest and wasn't quite alertness either. The vehicle was parked in a quiet, controlled location somewhere private enough that external noise didn't keep pulling him out of himself. Andrew was in the front passenger seat now, turned slightly so he could monitor Tate through the rear view and over his shoulder without crowding him. Susie sat in the passenger seat, hands resting loosely on the seat even though the car wasn't moving yet. Her posture looked exhausted more than anything else, like she was running on the last stretch of adrenaline she had left. Tate sat in the middle of the front seat, chosen on instinct because it felt centered, contained, less exposed. His gaze drifted between the window and the seat in front of him, not fully focusing on either. Andrew sat in the driver's seat while Noah was in the back seat looking over the seat. Earlier at the hospital, Andrew had coordinated with the attending physician to administer a mild, short-acting, medically appropriate anxiolytic carefully dosed, documented, and monitored. Nothing experimental. Nothing hallucinatory. Just enough to reduce physiological arousal so Tate could stay grounded during transport and conversation. Now the effect was visible in subtle ways. His shoulders weren't as tight. His breathing had evened out slightly. But his awareness still came and went in waves. Andrew spoke gently, keeping his voice steady. We're going to take a short drive, he said. Nothing long, nothing stressful, just somewhere quiet so you're not in a hospital environment. Tate gave a faint nod, not fully verbal but acknowledging. Andrew finally started the car. The engine hummed softly, and they pulled onto a calm stretch of road away from traffic. For a while no one pushed conversation. Andrew waited for Tate's system to settle further before speaking again. When Tate did talk, it wasn't directed or structured at first. It came in fragments, observations, disconnected thoughts, pieces of memory and sensation rather than narrative. It's quieter like this, Tate said at one point, eyes on the passing trees, less pressure. That makes sense, Andrew replied calmly, less input helps your nervous system settle. Tate nodded slightly, as if filing that away without judgment. He continued speaking after a pause. I keep thinking I'm supposed to be doing something, he said, like I'm forgetting a step. You're not required to do anything right now, Andrew said, just notice what's here. Tate looked down at his hands for a moment, flexing his fingers once, like checking whether they belonged to him fully. After a while his speech drifted again. I remember rooms, he said, different versions of them like the same place but not consistent. Andrew didn't interrupt, he just listened. That can happen when your mind is under strain, Andrew said gently. It can blend memory, perception, and emotional association. Tate didn't respond directly, but his breathing shifted slightly, less guarded now. Susie glanced at him in the rearview mirror but stayed quiet, letting Andrew guide the rhythm. As the drive continued, Tate's speech slowed. The fragmented quality softened into longer pauses between thoughts. The medication wasn't changing what he believed or experienced, it was simply lowering the intensity that usually pulled him into spirals. For a brief stretch, the car was just a car. Movement, road noise, rain sounds fatting on the pavement. After about an hour, Andrew noticed the shift. Tate's responses became less automatic. His gaze started to track more consistently. The pauses between thoughts lengthened, not from confusion but from reorientation. He rubbed his thumb against his palm, then looked toward the window again. It feels like I was further away earlier, Tate said quietly. Andrew nodded. That's a good way to describe dissociation lifting. Things can feel distant when you're in it and more present when it resolves. Tate didn't answer immediately, but something in his posture changed, subtle like weight redistributing. Susie exhaled slowly, tension easing just slightly from her shoulders. Andrew continued steady and calm. You don't have to fill in every gap right now, he said. Just stay with what feels real in this moment, the rest can wait. Tate looked down again, then nodded once. Okay, he said quietly. And for the first time in a while, it wasn't a fight to stay in the present, it was just a slow return to it, piece by piece, without anything forcing him away from it. The car rolled slowly down the side street near Tate's home, tires whispering over damp pavement. Streetlights reflected in thin streaks across the windshield, the kind of light that made everything feel slightly suspended, like time had softened at the edges. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter now. Not tense the way it had been earlier. Just heavy in a calmer way. Tate sat back in the seat, his posture looser than before. The medication hadn't erased anything, it had just taken the sharp edges off his reactions, dulled the urgency that usually sat underneath everything he did. Andrew glanced back at him through the rearview mirror, then gently reached over and tapped Tate's knee. Hey kid, Andrew said softly, stay with us, don't drift off too far, all right? Tate's head tilted slightly at the sound of his voice. His eyelids fluttered. I can't, Tate murmured, voice low and slow, not distressed, just heavy with fatigue. That's okay, Andrew replied calmly. You don't have to force anything, just stay with me for a bit. Tate's breathing stayed even. His shoulders were no longer tense, no longer braced as they had been earlier in the day. There was still distance in his expression, but it wasn't the same kind of absence Susie had seen before. This was softer, slower, more grounded even if incomplete. His eyes opened more fully after a moment, turning slightly toward Andrew's voice. Andrew met his gaze gently. Hey, Andrew said, you're safe right now. Tate blinked once. Then again. He didn't respond immediately, but his focus held a little longer this time, less slipping away, more arriving. Susie kept her hands on her lap, watching him in the mirror with cautious relief. Tate's voice came out after a pause. It feels quiet, he said. Andrew nodded. That's the medication easing the stress response. Your system is settling. Tate seemed to consider that, eyes drifting briefly toward the window where the street passed slowly by. He didn't look alarmed. He didn't look euphoric either. Just distant in a more stable way, like he was finally able to observe instead of react. After a moment he added quietly, I can think better like this. That's the goal, Andrew said. Not to change your thoughts, just to give you space from the intensity around them. Tate didn't answer right away. His fingers moved slightly in his lap, slow and unfocused, like testing whether his body felt consistent. Then, almost inaudibly, he said, It doesn't feel like it's pulling me anywhere. Andrew's expression softened. That's good, he said, that's what we want right now. The car continued down the street at a slow, controlled pace, nearing the familiar block where everything had started earlier that week. But for the first time in days, Tate wasn't being dragged through his thoughts. He was simply sitting inside them, present enough to notice but not overwhelmed enough to be consumed. Tate opened his eyes slowly. The world came back in pieces first. The hum of the engine, the low rattle of the windshield against the frame, the soft rhythm of tires over gravel, each sound arriving slightly out of sync as if his mind was still assembling them. He turned his head to the left. Andrew was there. Driving. Hands steady on the wheel, posture controlled, eyes forward but aware. Just a man in a seat. Just Andrew. But something in Tate's body didn't accept that immediately. The seatbelt across his chest suddenly felt heavier, not tight in a physical sense but present in a way that made him hyper-aware of being contained. The motion of the car, once soothing, shifted into something else, something layered with memory he couldn't fully name. His breathing changed first. Not dramatically. Just subtly, like his system recognized a pattern before his thoughts did. A flicker. A misfire of recognition. And then the feeling hit all at once. Not a clear thought. Not a single image. More like an accumulation of fragments pressing forward at the same time, places he couldn't fully place, sensations without timestamps, emotional echoes without context. Tate's shoulders tightened instantly. His grip on himself changed. "Hey kid," Andrew reassured while driving. Andrew happened to glance over at that exact moment, just a brief check-in through the rearview and over his shoulder. And when their eyes met just for a second, something inside Tate locked. Not anger. Not intention. A reflexive shutdown. Tate visibly flinched like he saw a glimpse of the devil. His whole body went rigid as if every muscle had been instructed at once to hold still. Tate's face twisted into terror, something that Andrew hadn't seen in years while working with disturbed or traumatized patients. Tate's reaction to Andrew sitting in the driver's seat was like a precursor to something terrifying. Something Andrew couldn't understand but Tate seemed to understand enough for everyone. Andrew had the feeling that Tate wasn't seeing Andrew at all, but something or someone that Tate was more terrified of than the devil. "Tate," Andrew said immediately, voice steady but alert. But Tate wasn't fully responding anymore. His gaze didn't stay anchored, it flickered between Andrew's face and something beyond it, something internal that had become more real than the present moment. His breath shortened, uneven, as his body had momentarily forgotten the rhythm it was supposed to follow. Susie noticed instantly from the passenger seat. Hey, she said, easing her tone but shifting her attention fully into the rearview mirror now. "Talk to me, you're okay." Tate didn't answer. Not because he was refusing to, but because the connection between thought and speech had dulled, like the pathway had become temporarily inaccessible. His hands curled slightly in his lap, then released again, small restless motions that didn't complete into anything purposeful. Andrew's voice stayed calm. "Look at me, Tate," he said gently. "You're in the car, you're safe, nothing is happening to you right now." But Tate's focus didn't settle. Instead, it fractured further like his attention was being pulled in two directions at once, the present moment in the car and something older pressing up underneath it. His body stayed rigid, but it wasn't aggression or resistance. It was more like a system overload, his nervous system holding everything at maximum tension while it tried to decide what was real. Andrew began slowing the truck, instinctively easing off the speed. "Tate, breathe with me," she said, firmer now but still controlled. "In and out, just stay with my voice." Andrew leaned slightly forward, keeping his tone even. "You're not in danger," he repeated. "You're having a stress response, it will pass." Tate's breathing remained uneven, but gradually, very gradually, the intensity of the moment stopped escalating. Not resolving yet, but pausing. Like the system had hit a ceiling instead of continuing downward. His head tilted slightly back against the seat. His eyes were still open but less focused now, less locked onto anything in particular. Andrew kept the truck steady as it rolled toward the side of the road. Hazards clicked on. The world outside continued moving, distant cars, muted road noise, indifferent motion, but inside the car everything narrowed again into controlled space and careful voices. "Tate," Andrew said softly, "stay with us, you're okay, just stay here with me." And slowly, without force, without sudden change, Tate remained where he was. Not fully present. Not gone. but suspended in that difficult middle place where awareness returns in fragments rather than all at once. Tate's breathing collapsed into something uneven and shallow. Not a clean stopping point, more like his body forgetting the rhythm it was supposed to maintain. His throat felt tight, constricted, as if the air itself had become difficult to interpret rather than physically absent. His head stayed turned toward Andrew. But Andrew wasn't fully Andrew in that moment to him. It was like his perception had split, one part registering a familiar face, another overlaying something older, something unplaceable, something his nervous system reacted to before his mind could explain it. "Tate," Andrew said immediately, voice steady but sharpened now with urgency. "Look at me, you're in the car, you're safe." Tate didn't respond in a verbal way. His body, however, reacted strongly. His shoulders locked first, then his arms began moving in abrupt, uncoordinated motions, small defensive swats at the space near his side, like his brain had misfired a threat response and his body was trying to obey it. Susie's voice cut through from the next seat, alarm rising. "Andrew, he's not coming back, he's not." Tate spoke in the deep, masculine tone he always seemed to slip into whenever he dissociated. It wasn't his normal voice. This voice belonged to someone else entirely, an unfamiliar man speaking through him. "Stop moving, Tatum. If you make too much noise, you'll wake up Noah." Noah froze. He lay perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. Andrew and Susie's eyes met across the front seat of Susie's car. Neither said a word, but their expressions spoke for them. "What the fuck?" Tate's head remained still, his expression strangely vacant. Then he spoke again in that same wrong voice, calm and almost eerily gentle. "It'll be our little secret." Andrew stared at him, his face tightening with concern. Susie swallowed hard, unable to look away. That wasn't Tate's voice. And whatever part of Tate was speaking to them now seemed to belong to someone neither of them knew. "Doesn't that feel good when I do that?" Tate said, but the voice that came out wasn't his own. It was that same deep, unfamiliar masculine voice, the one that appeared whenever he dissociated. Noah went completely still. Andrew's expression changed immediately. Susie looked at him, alarm flashing across her face. Neither of them understood who Tate seemed to be speaking as, but they both knew they were witnessing something deeply unsettling. The voice continued, low and unfamiliar. "Just lie back and enjoy it. Stop moving or Noah will wake up." Susie and Andrew exchanged another horrified glance. They understood what Tate was referring to now. Whatever Tate was remembering, someone had been violating his boundaries while Noah was nearby, or at least that was what Tate's fractured memory seemed to be showing them. Neither of them spoke. In the back seat, Noah was still trying to understand what was happening. Tate remained completely detached, staring straight ahead as though he were somewhere else entirely. Andrew watched him carefully. "Tate," he said softly, "you're here, you're safe, you're in the car with us." For several seconds there was no response. Then Tate blinked, his breathing changing as though he were slowly finding his way back to the present. Tate spoke again, but this time the voice was completely different. It was the voice of a frightened child, somewhere between 6 and 10 years old. "Stop, you promised you'd never do it in front of Noah, it's too risky, stop." The words hung in the car. Susie went pale. Andrew stared at Tate, his expression tightening as the realization settled over him. This wasn't simply Tate changing his voice. He seemed to be slipping into a much younger state, reliving something he had buried for years. Noah remained frozen. Andrew slowly raised a hand, signaling everyone else not to move. "Tate," he said gently, keeping his voice calm, "you're safe." Tate's small voice trembled. "You promised." Tate's hand reached forward again, not directed, not deliberate in a conscious sense, but instinctive, grabbing at the nearest stable object, which happened to be the edge of the steering wheel where Andrew's hands gently steered the car. Andrew reacted instantly, tightening control of the wheel while easing pressure so the movement didn't destabilize the vehicle. The truck wobbled briefly but stayed on the road. "Hey," she snapped, fear breaking through now. "Tate, stop moving." But Andrew's tone came in immediately after hers, calmer, anchoring. "Tate, you are not in danger, let go of the wheel, you are safe, breathe with me." Tate didn't process the words fully at first. His focus was still fractured, split between sensation and perception, between the present moment and something internal that felt more urgent than anything outside the car. His grip loosened slightly. Not because he understood, but because the intensity in his system began to crest rather than climb. Susie tried to pull Tate back so he couldn't reach the wheel and jerk it hard enough to send them off the road, but Tate fought against her desperately. He refused to let go, gripping the steering wheel as though it were the one thing he absolutely needed to hold onto. Andrew guided the truck carefully toward the shoulder, hazard lights clicking on as they slowed. The tires crunched softly over gravel when they finally stopped. Silence rushed in afterward, not calm but abrupt. Andrew immediately shifted in his seat, turning fully now so he could face Tate without crowding him. "Tate," he said again, softer this time, "you're okay, you're not in trouble, you're having a stress episode, it will pass." Tate's breathing was still uneven, but the sharp panic edge began to dull slightly. His hands remained tense in his lap, then slowly loosened, fingers uncurling as if they had just realized they were holding something too tightly. Susie stayed frozen for a moment, chest rising and falling quickly, eyes locked on him in the mirror. Then she exhaled shakily. "I thought," she started, then stopped. Andrew didn't let the moment spiral. "We're stopped," he said firmly. "No one is in danger right now, just give it a second." Tate's head leaned slightly back against the seat. His gaze was still unfocused, but no longer actively reacting to imagined threats. The intensity had shifted from outward action to inward exhaustion. Slowly, gradually, the car became just a car again. And the road outside returned to being something they were all simply parked beside, not trapped inside. The car was already moving slowly, carefully guided by Andrew now as Susie tried to steady her breathing in the front passenger seat of her own truck. The rain had made the road uneven, small ruts and dips shifting the vehicle just enough to make everything feel more unstable than it really was. Susie flinched as the truck jolted over a rough patch. Okay," she muttered under her breath, gripping the seat handle instinctively. In the back, Tate reacted instantly. Not to danger. To perceived danger. His body snapped forward in a sudden protective reflex, hands rising too quickly, not fully coordinated. The movement wasn't aggressive, it was disorganized urgency, like his nervous system had misread the environment entirely. Susie felt the motion behind her and tensed. But instead of impact, she felt steadiness. Tate's hands had come up just in time to brace her, not forcefully, but instinctively, steadying her as the truck shifted again over the uneven road. It wasn't clear thinking. It was reflex layered over confusion. Hey, Susie said quickly, startled but trying to stay calm. "It's okay, I'm fine. Susie could tell by Tate's words that his dissociative state had found the man in his young adolescence. The voice Tate used was that of a small child, perhaps older than 6 but not yet 10 years of age. Tate wasn't responding to Susie fully, his attention was somewhere else entirely. His eyes were unfocused, fixed slightly past her shoulder as if he was seeing something that didn't match the interior of the car. His breathing was uneven again, not fully panicked, but caught in that unstable space where perception and memory overlapped. "You're safe," Tate said suddenly. His voice was soft. Detached. Not directed at Susie exactly, but through her, as if she were part of something else he was trying to stabilize. "You're safe," he repeated again, firmer this time. "Don't go to sleep, stay awake." Susie's expression shifted, confusion tightening into concern. "Tate," Andrew said from the driver's seat immediately, voice calm but grounded. "Look at me, you're in Susie's truck, there is no one else, you are safe right now." Tate didn't fully register the correction at first. His hands hovered in the air for a moment longer, then slowly lowered, but not in full release, more like uncertainty fading rather than comprehension arriving. "No," he said quietly. Susie's stomach tightened. Andrew didn't react sharply, just kept his tone steady. "Tate," he said again, "stay with my voice, you are not where your mind is telling you, you're in the present." A pause. The car continued forward at a controlled speed, tires rolling smoothly again as the road evened out. Tate blinked slowly. Once. Then again. His gaze shifted slightly, not fully focused but beginning to re-anchor. He started then stopped. His throat moved as he swallowed, like the effort of organizing thought was physically heavy. I thought, he murmured but didn't finish the sentence. Susie turned slightly in her seat, watching him now with cautious relief. It's okay, she said more softly this time. You don't have to explain it right now. Tate's shoulders dropped a fraction, tension releasing in stages rather than all at once. Andrew kept his voice even. You had a stress response, he said. Your perception shifted, that's why things felt different from what they are. Tate didn't answer immediately. But he stayed present this time. Not pulled forward. Not reaching. Just sitting in the moment, breathing unevenly but no longer acting on what his mind was misfiring. The truck continued down the road in controlled silence. And for the first time in that drive, the distance between what Tate was experiencing and what was actually happening began to narrow instead of widen. Susie's breathing slowed as the pieces started to click into place, not as a sudden revelation, but as a pattern she could finally name. Tate wasn't reacting to this car in the way she'd first assumed. He was reacting to something layered over it. Something older. Something stored so deeply it didn't arrive as a story, but as a reflex. Her hands loosened slightly on the edge of the seat as she kept driving under Andrew's careful control of the wheel. The road had evened out again, the earlier jolt fading into a steady hum of tires and rain. But inside the vehicle, the emotional weight of what had just happened didn't dissipate with it. Tate sat in the back seat, still quiet now. Not fully gone. Not fully back either. Just suspended in that in-between state where awareness had returned enough to pause the chaos, but not enough to fully interpret it. And Susie watched him differently now. Not as someone reacting to random danger, but as someone reliving something specific. Andrew spoke first, voice low so it didn't disturb Tate's fragile focus. You saw it too, he said. Susie nodded once, eyes still forward. Yeah. A pause stretched between them. Not uncertainty anymore, recognition. Tate's earlier movement hadn't been purely defensive in a present tense sense. It had been precise in a way that didn't match the situation they were in now. The way his hands had reached, the way his attention had locked onto a position that didn't correspond to Susie's actual movement in the car, it had all carried the structure of something remembered, not something happening. Susie swallowed. He wasn't responding to me like I was me, she said quietly. He was responding like I was someone else. Andrew didn't answer immediately, but his expression shifted slightly, focused, analytical but not detached. That's what it looked like, he agreed. Tate shifted faintly in the back seat. Not waking fully but adjusting, like something in him was trying to settle into a more coherent shape again. Susie glanced at him through the mirror, then back at the road. It wasn't random, she continued. The way he moved, he wasn't attacking, he was. She hesitated, searching for the right word. Protecting, Andrew finished gently. Susie exhaled through her nose, almost a laugh that didn't quite form. Yeah, she said, protecting. Another pause. The truck moved steadily forward, rain soft against the windshield. Andrew kept one hand lightly on the wheel, but his attention was split between the road and what they were both realizing. If you strip away the context of where we are right now, Andrew said carefully, and look only at his behavior pattern, it fits a memory-based response. Susie nodded slowly, like a flashback. Not necessarily visual in a clear narrative sense, Andrew said, more like procedural memory with emotional tagging. His body remembers the action before his mind remembers the setting. Susie glanced back again. Tate's head was slightly tilted now, eyes half lowered, breathing steadier than before. And suddenly the earlier pieces reassembled in her mind with uncomfortable clarity. The way he had said you're safe. Not as a threat. Not as confusion. But as reassurance. As instruction. As if he had done this before. Her voice lowered further. So when he reached out, she said slowly, he wasn't trying to hurt me. Andrew shook his head once, no. He paused. He was trying to stop something from happening again. That settled into the car in a way that made everything quieter. Not calmer. Just heavier. Because it reframed the entire incident, not as chaos, not as danger, but as misapplied protection layered over a memory that still carried emotional weight. Susie gripped the wheel a little tighter again, but not from fear this time. From understanding that didn't quite feel easier. In the front seat, Tate shifted again. This time more noticeably. His eyes opened a little wider, unfocused but no longer trapped in the same intensity as before. He looked toward the window, then down at his hands. And for a moment, very briefly, there was a flicker of awareness that wasn't confused or fragmented. Just tired. I remember, he murmured. Andrew turned slightly. What do you remember? Tate didn't answer immediately. His throat moved as he swallowed, trying to organize something that didn't fully come out in order. Someone leaning forward, he said finally. Car moving too fast, I thought. He stopped. His fingers flexed once in his lap. I thought I had to stop it. Susie and Andrew didn't interrupt. They both stayed quiet in the same way, careful not to break the fragile thread forming between memory and present awareness. Tate exhaled slowly. Then added softer. I didn't know where I was for a second. Andrew nodded. That makes sense. Susie glanced at him again in the mirror. Andrew met her eyes briefly. No words were needed this time. They both understood the same thing. Tate's mind wasn't inventing danger out of nothing. It was replaying protection out of context. And that meant the work ahead wasn't about stopping aggression. It was about helping him learn where now ended and then began, before his body acted on memories that still felt like survival. Andrew didn't speak right away. Not because he didn't have anything to say, but because what Susie had just implied didn't sit neatly in any of the frameworks he normally used to organize clinical information. He kept one hand on the wheel, eyes forward, but his attention had shifted inward. Because there was a problem in the memory they were reconstructing. A structural one. If Tate was recalling an incident where he reached out and protected Noah from hitting the dashboard, then the basic physics of the moment didn't fully align with the role he was assigning himself inside it. Andrew's mind did what trained clinicians do almost automatically. It started reconstructing the event in layers. Positioning. Occupancy. Motor coordination. Sequence. If Tate was in the middle front passenger seat and Noah was by him and the door in the memory, then someone else had to be driving. Andrew suddenly thought of something that made his stomach drop. Nobody else in the car seemed to have considered it. If Tate had reached across to protect Noah's head, how had he managed to do that while supposedly driving? Who was driving the car while Tate protected Noah's head from hitting the dash? Andrew looked at Tate, then at the position where Tate was sitting now. The answer came to him. Tate must have been sitting in the middle seat. That would explain everything. If he had been driving, he couldn't have reached across and protected Noah without losing control of the vehicle. But if Tate had been sitting in the middle, he could have thrown himself toward Noah, shielding his head and preventing him from suffering a concussion. Andrew's eyes widened. That meant they hadn't gone off the road because Tate had reached across. Someone else had been driving. And suddenly, the memory Tate had been reliving seemed far more complicated and far more frightening than Andrew had first realized. If Tate was driving, then he couldn't simultaneously be leaning across to physically protect someone in the adjacent seat with precision and timing consistent with what he was describing. And if neither of those configurations made sense cleanly, then the memory itself wasn't a literal replay. It was something else. Andrew's jaw tightened slightly as he kept his expression neutral so Susie wouldn't see the shift in his thinking too clearly. He didn't want to alarm her, not yet. Not when Tate was still only just beginning to stabilize in the back seat. But internally, the question had already formed. What exactly is Tate reconstructing? Susie glanced at him. You're thinking the same thing I am, aren't you? She asked quietly. Andrew didn't answer immediately. He chose his words carefully. I'm thinking about consistency, he said at last. That's not an answer, Susie replied, but without pressure, just exhaustion. I know, Andrew said softly, but it's the most accurate starting point. He took a breath, eyes still on the road. In a memory like the one he described, that there are a few possible configurations, he continued. One is that the memory is partially accurate but compressed details merged over time. Another is that he's not recalling the event as an external observer but reconstructing it from emotional impact rather than literal sequence. Susie frowned slightly, meaning. Andrew glanced briefly toward the rearview mirror. Tate may not be remembering what happened, he said carefully. He may be remembering how it felt to be responsible for preventing harm. That landed differently. Susie went quiet. Andrew continued more slowly now. In trauma-linked or high-stress encoding, the brain doesn't always store events as clean narratives. It stores roles, urgency states, and emotional outcomes. So later, when something similar is triggered, like instability, motion, perceived threat, it can reconstruct the role instead of the event. He paused. In other words, he may not be replaying a specific moment. Susie's voice was barely audible. He's replaying being the person who prevents something bad from happening. Yes, Andrew said. Another stretch of silence filled the cab. The road passed beneath them steadily, rain thinning slightly, wipers moving in a slow, rhythmic arc. Andrew's thoughts didn't stop there, though. Because even that explanation didn't fully resolve the deeper inconsistency he was circling. If Tate's mind was constructing a protective scenario, why that scenario? Why a car? Why was a passenger being saved from impact? Why the specific urgency around preventing head injury? Why did Tate grab the wheel for no apparent reason and refuse to let go? Andrew's clinical mind began mapping associations, not conclusions but possibilities. Was this anchored in an actual past event that had been misfiled and reshaped? Was it symbolic, Tate's mind using car safety as a template for emotional responsibility? Or was it a composite memory, multiple moments of caretaking collapsed into one intense, repeatable script? And then another thought surfaced, quieter but sharper. If the emotional core of the memory was the protection of Noah, then the trigger wasn't just motion or stress. It was relational. Attachment-linked threat perception. Andrew exhaled slowly through his nose, keeping his posture calm. Because that would also explain something else. Why Tate's episodes weren't purely random. Why it clustered around proximity, responsibility, and perceived loss of control in situations involving Noah or symbolic substitutes. Susie broke the silence again, softer this time. So what do we do with that? She asked. Andrew didn't answer immediately. Because the honest answer wasn't simple. But he kept his tone steady when he finally spoke. We don't challenge the memory directly, he said. Not while he's still this unstable. We stabilize first, then we help him separate emotional responsibility from present reality. He paused, then added more quietly. And we start identifying what actually belongs to the past, and what his mind is still trying to prevent from happening again. In the front seat, Tate shifted slightly. Still quiet. Still present enough now to hear them. But not yet anchored enough to correct the story his mind was still trying to finish. Andrew didn't respond immediately. The truck had just come to a full stop in Talia's driveway, gravel crunching softly beneath the tires. The engine idled low and steady, but inside the truck the air felt anything but settled. Tate's voice had broken through the quiet in a way that didn't match the rest of his presentation. It wasn't Tate's usual sarcastic voice. Not loud. Not panicked. But off like it belonged to a different layer of thought. 2 hours taught him, just you and me, and no one needs to ever know. It will be like old times. I'll stay away. I won't tell Noah the truth, Tate murmured again in a masculine voice very different from his own, more clearly this time. It was the masculine voice that Tate always used when he dissociated. His gaze wasn't fully on either of them. It was angled slightly downward, as if he were reading something that wasn't physically there. 2 hours or we go back from where we came. Susie went still in the passenger seat. Susie glanced at Andrew. His hands were still firmly gripping the steering wheel. She leaned closer, careful to keep her voice low enough not to disturb Tate. Andrew, she whispered, tell Noah what? What didn't Tate want Noah to be told? Andrew didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the road. I don't know, he whispered back, but whatever Tate is remembering, he was terrified Noah would find out. Susie looked toward Tate, who was still sitting motionless, his expression distant. Then maybe that's what we need to figure out, she murmured. What happened that Tate was so desperate to keep from Noah? Andrew's hand paused near the ignition, but he didn't shut the car off yet. Tate continued, almost under his breath now. 2 hours of my time, and you'll make me forget about him. The words didn't land like a coherent request. They landed like fragments of a script his mind had retrieved without context. Susie slowly turned her head toward Andrew. Her expression was sharp now, not panicked, but alert in a way that came from too many recent near spirals. "What is he talking about?" she whispered. Andrew didn't answer right away. His attention had already shifted fully to Tate. Tate's posture hadn't changed much. He wasn't thrashing anymore. He wasn't actively dissociating in the dramatic way they'd seen earlier in the drive. This was different, quieter, more internal. But Andrew recognized something in it. Not clarity. Not stability. But lingering cognitive bleed-through from a prior state, where thought fragments, emotional residues, and misattributed meaning can surface without proper grounding. He spoke carefully. "Tate," Andrew said, voice even not challenging, "where are you right now?" Tate didn't answer immediately. His fingers flexed once in his lap. Then again. Like he was checking whether the world was responsive. Tate's breathing suddenly changed. His voice came out raspy, but this time it was unmistakably his own. "I'm on South Vermont Avenue," he murmured. Everyone in the car went silent. Andrew glanced at Susie, his hands tightening around the steering wheel. Tate swallowed, his eyes still unfocused. "I'm 25, he whispered. Noah stared at him from the backseat. "What does that mean, Tate?" he asked quietly. The present Tate was 28 years old. Tate didn't answer, his head tilted slightly, as though he were trying to pull the rest of the memory into focus. 2 hours, Tate repeated softly in a wrong masculine voice, but now less directed, more like he was trying to place the phrase into context. "That's what it takes." Susie's jaw tightened. "Andrew," she said quietly, "that sounds like bargaining." "I know," Andrew replied just as softly. But he still didn't escalate. Because escalation wasn't what this moment needed yet. He leaned slightly back in his seat so Tate could see him without feeling cornered. "Tate," he said again, gentler this time, "listen to me. You're at your mom's house, you're in the car with Susie, you just came off a stressful drive." Tate blinked slowly. Once. Then his eyes shifted, not fully focused but trying to re-anchor on the environment. The driveway, the house, the stillness. The present tense. For a second, it looked like it might connect. But the phrase still lingered. 2 hours. No one has to know. Andrew's mind worked through possibilities, carefully separating tone from content. Was this a dissociated replay of a negotiation? A misfired memory of responsibility? A stress-linked attempt to regain control through structured exchange? Or something simpler but more concerning? A cognitive echo of earlier emotional reasoning that had not fully resolved. Susie spoke again, quieter now. "He's not making sense," she said. "He sounds like he's talking to someone who isn't here." Andrew nodded slightly. "He's not fully anchored yet." Tate shifted again on the back seat. This time his head lifted slightly, and his gaze finally moved between them with more awareness than before, but still uneven. Tate started, then stopped. His throat moved as he swallowed. "I don't know why I said that." Andrew didn't press. Instead, he softened his tone further. "That's okay," he said. "We're not going to assign meaning to it right now. We're going to focus on grounding you back into where you are." A pause. Then Andrew added, "You don't need to negotiate your way through this moment." That landed differently. Not instantly resolving anything, but interrupting the loop. Susie exhaled slowly, some tension leaving her shoulders. Tate looked down at his hands again. This time more steadily. Less searching. More present. And in the quiet that followed, the driveway, the house, and the stillness outside the truck began to feel less like part of a fragmented experience, and more like something he could actually stay inside of without slipping away. Tate's usual voice began to emerge again, raspy but unmistakably his. "I don't want to do Chernobyl," he said quietly. "You can do whatever you want, but I'm not dying for love or for you." His breathing hitched. "I won't do that to Noah." Noah's face went pale in the backseat. He stared at Tate, hearing the words as though they carried a meaning everyone else already understood. "Tate," Noah whispered. Tate's eyes remained unfocused, but his expression tightened. "I won't leave him like that," he murmured. "I won't make Noah live with that." Andrew leaned forward from the passenger seat and opened the glove compartment. After rummaging through it for a moment, he pulled out a clean cloth. Unscrewing his water bottle, he dampened the fabric before gently folding it into a makeshift cold compress. "Hey kid," Andrew said, resting a hand on Tate's thigh. "Are you doing okay?" Tate's entire body suddenly turned toward Andrew. And that's when Andrew saw it. The look on Tate's face was pure terror, as though he were staring directly at a nightmare. Tate recoiled from the driver, pressing himself away from Andrew and nearly climbing over Susie in his desperate attempt to get farther away. Andrew immediately pulled his hand back. "Tate." Tate didn't answer. He kept staring at Andrew as though he wasn't seeing Andrew at all. Andrew noticed that Tate had instinctively covered Susie's body with his own, as though he were trying to protect her. Susie pushed Tate off her. "Move, Tate." Tate fell back into the middle seat on the driver's side. His entire body went rigid. He stopped moving. Then Andrew realized Tate wasn't breathing. A strained sound escaped Tate's throat, as though he were struggling for air. Noah immediately leaned forward from the back seat and gently placed a hand around Tate's head. "You're okay, Tate," Noah said softly. "You're here with me, you're safe." Tate remained completely rigid, his eyes wide with terror. Noah kept his hand against Tate's head. "Look at me, you're safe, I'm right here." Tate's whole body became rigid, almost like rigor mortis. His fingers, joints, and knuckles were completely stiff, and even Noah could feel the tension through his hands. His legs were rigid too, making him look almost like a doll. Tate suddenly began to choke. The sound that came from his throat was horribly familiar. Talia and Andrew had heard that same sound at the Bistro Cafe on the day Tate had suffered the worst seizure either of them had ever witnessed. It sounded as though he were being strangled, as though every breath was being forced backward down his throat. "Tate," Noah cried from the backseat. Andrew immediately focused on him, keeping control of the car while Susie turned toward Tate. Tate's chest heaved, but the sound coming from him was barely recognizable as breathing. His hands tightened, his body beginning to tremble as the memory and whatever was happening physically seemed to collide. "That's the sound," Andrew said, his voice tense. "Susie, that's exactly the sound he made at the cafe." Susie's face went pale. "I remember Talia telling me about it." Noah stared at Tate, terrified. "Tate, please," he whispered. "Breathe, please." Then Tate's arms suddenly started moving again. His hand began making frantic swiping motions over his upper thigh, as though he were desperately trying to swat away a mosquito he couldn't see. Tate's entire body suddenly went rigid, every limb straightening until he looked almost like a plank of wood. He wasn't moving at all. Paralyzed was the only word Andrew could think of. Tate's eyes were enormous, his pupils wide with terror. He looked completely lost. He didn't seem to know where he was or what was happening around him. His gaze darted wildly, searching for something or someone that wasn't there. "Tate," Andrew said carefully. Tate couldn't answer. His whole body remained locked in place as though he were fighting against something no one else could see. Whatever force he was struggling against seemed stronger than him, larger than him, and completely beyond his control. Noah pressed himself against the backseat, staring at Tate in horror. "He's terrified," Noah whispered. Andrew nodded, keeping his voice low and steady. "I know." Tate's eyes remained fixed ahead, wide with pure panic. For a moment, Andrew had the unsettling impression that Tate wasn't fighting the people in the car at all. He was fighting something from the past. Andrew watched closely. Tate's movements became increasingly frantic, his arm flailing repeatedly across his thigh while the rest of his body remained stiff. "Tate," Noah said softly, "you're okay, you're safe." But Tate kept swiping at his leg, seemingly unaware of anyone around him. Tate was sweating as though he had just run a 10-mile race, even though he hadn't moved more than an occasional twitch. He remained completely stationary in the seat, his body rigid and his breathing strained. Yet sweat had begun to bead across his forehead and run down the sides of his face. It didn't make sense. Andrew could practically feel the adrenaline coming off Tate. His entire body appeared to be reacting as though he were in immediate danger, despite there being nothing visible around him. Tate's eyes darted from one side of the car to the other. He looked like a gazelle that had suddenly realized a lion was walking slowly around it. The lion wasn't attacking. It didn't have to. Just knowing it was there was enough. Tate's expression was pure terror. He watched something Andrew couldn't see, following it with his eyes as though it were circling him, studying him, waiting. "Tate," Andrew said softly, "there's nothing here, you're in the car with us." Tate didn't respond. Another tremor passed through his body. Noah watched from the backseat, his own breathing becoming shallow. "He thinks something is coming for him," Noah whispered. Andrew looked at Tate again. "Yes," he said quietly, "I think he does." "Susie, grab the cold compress," Andrew said. "I put in the glove compartment, he's burning up." The car was parked, and Susie immediately opened the glove compartment and began searching for it. Andrew noticed Tate staring directly at the open compartment. His eyes were wide, almost as large as dinner plates. He was still making that strained, suffocating sound in the back of his throat, his body rigid as he stared at the glove compartment as though something inside it terrified him. "Tate," Noah said softly. Tate didn't answer. His eyes never left the compartment. Tate moved with startling precision. Before Andrew or Susie could react, he climbed over Susie, who was sitting beside the passenger door, shoved it open and launched himself out of the car. Then he ran. He ran as though the devil himself were chasing him. No one in that car had ever seen Tate move that fast. Not even Andrew, who had known him for years, could remember seeing him run with that kind of desperate speed. Unless it involved ghosts, Tate was never afraid or ran that fast to get away from anything or anyone. "Tate," Susie shouted. Tate kept going. He ran nearly 1,000 feet before something stopped him. It was like there was an invisible wall that stopped him, but there wasn't. There was nothing there. No wall, no fence, nothing Andrew could see. Yet Tate slammed to a halt as though he had hit an invisible barrier. He stood frozen, breathing hard, his entire body trembling. Then he slowly turned around and looked back toward the car. His eyes settled on Andrew. Andrew stepped out of the car. "Tate!" Tate suddenly darted to the left, heading toward the warehouse door. He disappeared around the side of it. Andrew and Susie exchanged a stunned look before following. But after a few moments, Tate stopped. Then strangely, he began walking backward. One slow step at a time, Tate retreated toward the warehouse door, his eyes still fixed on something behind him. He reached the entrance. For one final second he stood there. Then he disappeared backward into the darkness. The warehouse door slammed shut. Noah exhaled sharply, unsure how Tate's condition had worsened in such a short span of time. "I don't understand," Noah said. "He was fine like minutes ago, he was sitting there talking. What changed?" Andrew looked toward the garage again. "That's the problem with these episodes," Andrew said carefully. "Sometimes there isn't a visible change from the outside. The shift is internal, and once it tips past a threshold, the body reacts before language can catch up." Susie swallowed hard. "So he's just gone into panic mode?" she asked. "More like his nervous system chose escape as the safest option," Andrew corrected gently. Noah went quiet for a moment. Then his voice came again, lower now. "Is he okay?" "I don't know yet," Susie admitted. "He's not hurt, he just ran." Andrew finally opened his car door slightly, but didn't step out yet. "I'm going to approach slowly," he said. "No sudden movement, we don't chase him, we wait for him to settle." Noah's voice tightened. "Andrew, be careful." "I will," Andrew said simply. A pause. Then Noah again, quieter. "Does he even know where he is right now?" Andrew looked at the garage door, half closed still. "Not fully," he said. And in that moment, all three of them understood the same thing in different ways. Tate hadn't left them. He had left the state he was in. And getting him back wasn't going to be about catching him, it was going to be about waiting for his mind to recognize the present again. Andrew's decision was immediate. "Stay in the car," he said firmly to Susie, already shifting his weight toward the door. "I'm going to check on him." Susie grabbed his sleeve before he could fully step out. "Andrew, he ran like he was terrified," she said, voice tight. "What if he hurts himself again?" Andrew met her eyes for a brief second. "Then we approach carefully," he said, "but we don't let him be alone in a dissociative escalation." Noah had watched the entire dissociative episode unfold from the backseat, and what he had just witnessed sent a chill through him. It reminded him of the nightmare. The pickup truck. Tate jumping out and running as though his life depended on it. The man with the gun. In the nightmare, the man had raised the weapon toward Tate, forcing him to stop and turn around. Then there had been a struggle, brief, chaotic, terrifying. And now Noah had watched Tate do something eerily similar in real life. Tate had run. He had reached an invisible boundary and stopped as though someone had physically ordered him to. Then he had turned around. Noah's stomach dropped. It was almost as if Tate had been reenacting the nightmare without knowing it. The memory of the dream came rushing back to Noah, Tate's terrified face, the gun, the struggle, and the awful feeling that Tate had been fighting for his life. Noah stared at the warehouse door where Tate had disappeared. "Andrew," he whispered, his voice shaking, "that's what I saw." Andrew turned toward him. "What?" "In my dream," Noah said, "Tate did this. He ran from the truck. Someone pointed a gun at him. Tate stopped and turned around." Susie looked between them. Noah swallowed hard. "He did exactly what he did in my nightmare." Before Andrew could respond, a sound cut through the air from inside the garage. "Tate." Not words at first, just raw, strained vocalization that echoed sharply off the enclosed space. It sounded like Tate was being tortured in the garage, which unnerved everyone who was listening. Susie went rigid. "Oh my God," she whispered. Andrew didn't hesitate anymore. He moved. "Tate," Andrew called, voice raised just enough to carry but still controlled. "It's Andrew, I'm coming in slowly, you're safe." He pushed the garage door open wider and stepped inside. The light inside was dim, filtered through dusty windows and the half-open door. Everything felt suddenly still compared to the chaos of the moment before. Tate was on the floor, his cheek flush against the floor near the side wall. Not fighting anything visible in the room but clearly overwhelmed. His body was tense in uneven waves, arms moving in short, uncoordinated bursts that didn't resolve into anything purposeful. His breathing was irregular, caught between rapid escalation and abrupt pauses. Andrew could see it in Tate's eyes. He was terrified. Not confused, not merely disoriented after the episode, terrified. Tate's eyes darted toward the dark corners of the warehouse before snapping back to Andrew. His breathing quickened, and his fingers curled against the cold concrete as though he were bracing himself for something Andrew couldn't see. "Tate," Andrew said softly, "look at me." Tate did, but only for a second. His gaze immediately shifted toward the warehouse door. Andrew followed his eyes. There was nothing there. Yet Tate looked as though he expected someone or something to walk through it at any moment. "What are you afraid of?" Andrew whispered. Tate swallowed hard. His lips parted but no words came. Andrew could see the answer in his face anyway. Whatever Tate was seeing in his mind, he was convinced it was still there. "Hey," Andrew said immediately, lowering his voice. "Tate, look at me." Tate's eyes flickered in his direction but didn't fully land. Andrew stayed at the threshold, not rushing forward. "You're in your mom's garage," Andrew said steadily. "You're safe, you're not in danger right now." Susie appeared behind Andrew in the doorway but stayed back, watching with alarm. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "He was fine 2 minutes ago." Andrew didn't look away from Tate. "I know," he replied. "This isn't linear, it's a nervous system spike. It can look sudden from the outside. Shut the door, Susie, I'll be out in a few minutes." Tate's voice broke through, uneven and low. "I ran," he said. "Yes," Andrew replied calmly, "you did, and you're here now." Tate swallowed hard. His hands loosened slightly from their tight position near his chest, then tightened again as if his body was still deciding what state it was in. "I couldn't stay," Tate said, quieter. "It felt like I had to get out." "That's a fight-or-flight response," Andrew said. "It's automatic, not a choice." Susie stepped a fraction closer, still cautious. "Susie, get out, your presence isn't calming him." Tate didn't fully look at her yet, but his breathing began to slow in small increments, not stable but no longer escalating. Andrew kept his tone steady. "You're not in the car anymore," he said. "You're not driving, nothing is chasing you, you're in Talia's garage with me." A long pause followed. The garage was quiet except for Tate's uneven breathing and the faint ambient sounds of the house settling. Tate's shoulders lowered slightly. Not fully relaxed, but no longer locked in that peak state of alarm. I don't feel like I'm here all the way, he said. I know, Andrew replied. That's the episode easing off. It takes time for your system to come back down. Susie walked back to the car to check on Noah and exhaled shakily. So what do we do? She asked Noah. Susie shrugged. Inside the garage, Andrew finally stepped one cautious pace further into the dingy, dusty building, not closing distance quickly, just making his presence more stable in the space. Tate blinked slowly. Once. Then again. And for the first time since he ran into the garage, his gaze began to hold for more than a flicker, long enough to recognize where he was and who was still there with him. I know you're dissociating about the gay hate crime you survived, Andrew said quietly. It's okay, I'm not going to tell the others, just talk to me. What's going on? Who do you think I am? Who is your basher? Tate didn't answer. Andrew waited, watching Tate carefully. We don't get to see what goes on in your head, he said gently. You have to tell me what you're seeing. Tate nodded. Andrew leaned down until his ear was close to Tate's mouth. Tate began whispering. At first, Andrew could barely make out the words, then his expression changed. Whatever he had expected Tate to say, this wasn't it. Andrew had assumed Tate's terror was connected to the bashing. In a way, it was, but the truth was much more frightening. Tate didn't know who he was. He didn't know where he was. And he had no idea that Andrew was his friend. Tate stared at him with terrified eyes, convinced that Andrew was the person who had hurt him. Then Tate started talking. He began describing what had really been happening, his words fragmented and frightened, as though he were finally speaking about something he had never been able to tell anyone. Andrew listened without interrupting. His face slowly went white. Because Tate wasn't talking to Andrew. He was talking to the person he believed Andrew was. And with every whispered word, Andrew realized something that terrified him more than anything Tate had said before. He had spent years believing he knew Tate. Years listening to him, caring for him, trying to understand his behavior. But now, kneeling beside him on that filthy warehouse floor, Andrew realized he might never have understood who he had really been talking to all those years. Outside the car, Noah and Susie stood near the garage, watching through the window. Neither of them could hear what Andrew was saying. All they could see was Tate sitting rigidly in the back seat, staring at Andrew as though he were someone else entirely. 5 minutes after Andrew had gone back into the garage with Tate, the air outside felt heavier, eerie, wrong, odd, unnatural, which creeped out Susie. Susie hadn't moved from her spot near the driveway edge. Noah stood a few feet away, tense and watching the garage door like it might suddenly become unpredictable again. Then the garage shifted. Andrew stumbled backwards out of the garage in panic, not in the steady, controlled way he had gone in moments earlier. Andrew staggered backwards onto the driveway near the lawn in a dizzy, disgusted way. His shoulders were shaking and his whole body looked like it had survived something traumatic. Susie couldn't put into words what she saw from Andrew. Andrew almost tripped over his own feet, but he saved his balance by leaning against the garage wall. Andrew's reaction reminded Susie and Noah of the way Serena had reacted in Talia's kitchen before she died. There was the same look of distress. The same stunned, horrified expression. Andrew looked as though he had seen something he couldn't explain, something that had shaken him deeply. He was visibly horrified and traumatized, and for the first time, Noah and Susie realized that whatever Andrew was seeing in Tate was frightening him too. They both noticed the tears falling from Andrew's eyes. Whatever had happened inside the garage, it had been terrible. Andrew's entire sense of balance seemed to have disappeared. His usual composure was gone and his ability to stand upright appeared almost non-existent. He stumbled as he moved, catching himself again as he stumbled against the side of the garage. Noah and Susie exchanged a frightened glance. They had never seen Andrew like this before. Andrew had always been the picture of professional composure. He was one of the most respected psychologists in Los Angeles. He hadn't even reached 30 when he opened his own practice, yet he had already developed a reputation for being remarkably patient and exceptionally good at what he did. Even the mayor had personally met with him to thank him for the work he had been doing in the community over the previous 2 years. No one expected Andrew to lose control. He certainly never gave anyone reason to think he might. The only real glimpses of vulnerability Susie had ever seen came during Sunday dinners, when a conversation wandered too close to family or Andrew's past. On those occasions, he would sometimes quietly excuse himself and disappear upstairs, occasionally returning after smoking marijuana and composing himself. Susie had seen him upset. She had seen him angry. She had even seen him shaken. But what she was witnessing now was completely different. Andrew was kneeling beside Tate on the filthy garage floor, his face utterly transformed. The professional mask he wore so effortlessly was gone. There was fear in his eyes. Genuine, unmistakable fear. Susie stared at him from several feet away, unable to remember the last time she had seen her friend look like that. Whatever Tate was whispering into Andrew's ear, it had reached somewhere no patient, family member, or crisis had ever reached before. For once, Andrew didn't look like the psychologist who always knew what to say. He looked like a man who had just discovered that everything he thought he understood was wrong. Andrew could barely stand, his limbs were shaking. He moved backward through the doorway first, as if creating distance before fully exiting. His posture was tight, shoulders drawn in, one hand briefly bracing against the frame for balance. He didn't look at either of them. He just kept moving backwards. Susie stepped forward immediately. "Andrew," she said, "what happened?" He didn't answer. Not even a glance. His face was pale, white, horrified, and disgusted. Andrew took another step back onto the driveway, then stopped abruptly, bending slightly at the waist as he steadied himself, one hand pressing briefly to his midsection as he tried to regulate his breathing. Noah's expression changed instantly. "Is he worse?" Noah asked, voice sharp with concern. "Did something happen in there?" Still no response. Andrew shook his head once, not a clear answer, just a gesture that didn't clarify anything. His focus stayed downward, like he was trying to reorient himself away from what he had just witnessed. Susie lowered her voice. "Andrew, talk to us," she said. "Is Tate okay?" A long pause. Andrew's mouth was entirely covered by his left hand while he groaned in misery, his legs shaking from something Susie didn't understand. Andrew's face contorted in disgust. He jerked his head to the left, where he vomited violently all over the weeds by the garage wall. Susie had never seen Andrew lose his cool like that, nor respond in such a violent, negative way. What had happened in that garage that made Andrew sick? Was Tate okay? Andrew doubled over in the weeds again, one hand braced against the damp ground while the other clutched his stomach. A harsh, wet retch tore out of him before he violently vomited once more into the bushes beside the driveway. His whole body shook with it. They watched Andrew groan and moan in misery as he kept vomiting. It was violent and unexpected, leaving him visibly sick to his stomach. All the color had drained from Andrew's cheeks. He looked deathly pale, his face drawn and strained as though whatever had happened had deeply disturbed him. Noah stared at him in growing alarm. He had never seen Andrew this shaken before. Susie stood beside Noah, equally horrified, watching Andrew struggle to regain his composure. A few feet away, Susie stood frozen with her arms crossed tightly over herself while Noah hovered beside her, both of them staring at their friend with growing concern. "Andrew," Susie said carefully, taking a hesitant step forward, "maybe you should sit down." Andrew lifted a trembling hand toward her without turning around. No, don't come near me yet," he groaned hoarsely. Then another wave hit him. "Jesus Christ," Andrew moaned. He lurched forward again and threw up violently into the weeds. The sound echoed unpleasantly through the quiet night air. Noah winced instinctively. "Okay," Noah muttered, grimacing, "that is aggressive." Andrew spat onto the ground and sucked in several ragged breaths as he just survived a near-death experience. His face was pale beneath the porch lights, his eyes watery and bloodshot. "What the fuck?" Andrew suddenly yelled at the top of his lungs. A dog barked somewhere down the street. Susie rubbed his back cautiously. "You done?" "I don't know," Andrew croaked. Then immediately vomited again. Noah physically recoiled. "Oh my God." Andrew stayed bent over for several seconds after the last heave, breathing hard. Finally, he staggered backward away from the bushes and wiped his mouth with the sleeve of his expensive coat. He looked traumatized. "Oh my God," Andrew said weakly, "that was vile." Susie handed him a napkin from her purse. "What even happened in there?" Andrew stared at her like she'd asked him to explain war crimes. What happened, he repeated incredulously. Rich people happened. Noah frowned. Andrew. No, seriously, Andrew interrupted, still breathing unevenly. What the fuck is wrong with rich people? Andrew groaned miserably and sank down onto the curb, elbows resting on his knees as he shoved his head between his legs. The nausea wasn't entirely from Tate's PNES incident anymore. Watching Tate collapse in the garage, hearing the terror and helplessness in his voice afterward had ripped something open inside Andrew. Tate's confession, the obsession, the years of guilt, repression, and emotional instability had slammed directly into Andrew's own CPTSD like a truck. Without a shadow of a doubt, Andrew finally understood why Wayne had vomited after shaking Talia's hand at the fundraiser months earlier, and why he had immediately gone to wash his hands. He understood why Wayne had stared at Tate as though Tate were a disease. The memories suddenly connected. Andrew stood there, pale and trembling, as the realization settled over him. He finally understood the truth. His chest tightened painfully as adrenaline continued flooding his nervous system long after everything was supposedly over. He could still hear Tate's shaking voice in his head, still see himself kneeling beside Tate on the concrete floor. Andrew dragged a trembling hand through his hair and tried to steady his breathing, but anxiety crawled violently beneath his skin. Noah noticed immediately that this was no longer an ordinary sickness. His expression shifted from concern to alarm as he crouched beside him. Andrew, Noah said quietly, "Hey, look at me." Andrew only shook his head weakly, breathing unevenly. "I'm fine," he lied hoarsely. I think my brain short-circuited." "Why did you throw up?" Noah asked, his voice full of fear. "Why are you sick, Andrew? Are you okay?" Talia hurried over and knelt beside him. "Andrew." She reached down to support his head, but Andrew immediately recoiled from her touch. "Stay away from me," he said almost desperately. "I don't want to be touched." Talia froze and slowly withdrew her hands. "Okay," she said softly, "I won't touch you." Susie stared at Andrew, frightened by how pale he looked. Andrew's mouth fell open. "It's not true." He sounded as though he were trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "It's not true," he repeated, shaking his head. "It can't be true." Everyone stared at him. Andrew dragged a trembling hand across his face. "I've been so blind," his voice cracked. "I've had my head so far up my ass that I missed what was right in front of me the entire time." He looked down at Tate, then away again. "I'm the most blind psychologist imaginable." Andrew shook his head harder, refusing to accept whatever realization had begun taking shape in his mind. He wouldn't do that. His voice dropped to a whisper. He couldn't have done that. Susie stepped closer. "Andrew, who wouldn't do that? What did Tate tell you?" Andrew didn't answer. He simply stared at Tate, looking as though the foundations of everything he thought he knew about his friend had just collapsed beneath him. Andrew's composure finally shattered. Tears streamed down his face as he stared at Tate on the warehouse floor. What Tate had revealed seemed to echo something painfully familiar in Andrew's own history, turning Tate's story into a reflection of wounds Andrew had spent years trying to keep buried. "No, no, 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 no." Andrew shook his head repeatedly, as though refusing to let the realization become real. "Oh my God." Susie stepped toward him. "Andrew." He didn't answer. Then another thought struck him. "Serena knew." The words came out barely above a whisper. Andrew suddenly turned away and vomited again, bracing himself against the side of the vehicle. Susie rushed toward him, but Andrew raised a trembling hand, stopping her. He wiped his mouth, tears still running down his face. "She knew," he whispered again. And this time there was something different in his voice. Not confusion. Recognition. Andrew wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and forced himself to breathe. He knew what he needed to do. He needed to contact Dr. Michaels. She needed to know what he now knew. Whatever Tate had revealed had changed the entire picture, and Andrew was no longer willing to trust his own assumptions. He needed another professional, someone who could listen to what Tate had said and help him understand what they were dealing with. Andrew reached for his phone, his hands still trembling. "I need to call Dr. Michaels," he said quietly. Susie watched him. Now. Andrew looked back at Tate. "Yes," he said, "she needs to know." Andrew pulled out his mobile phone with trembling fingers. "Hello, yes, Dr. Michaels, this is Andrew." He swallowed hard. How am I doing? There was a pause. I'm doing terrible, Andrew admitted. I just threw up. Tate had another PNES seizure. I think we have a problem. We should meet to discuss what I've learned. Andrew stopped speaking. His expression changed as he listened to Dr. Michaels. What? He listened again. His eyes widened. Now. Another pause. Andrew looked toward Tate. No, I understand. He listened for several more seconds. Then he nodded slowly. We need to get Tate into a psychiatric ward now, Andrew said. Noah's face went pale. What? Andrew continued, still listening to the doctor. And I think I need to be under observation for the next 24 hours too. Susie stared at him. You. Andrew nodded. Yes. Noah stepped closer. Andrew, what happened? Andrew looked at him. For several seconds, he seemed unable to find the words. Then his voice dropped, talking to Dr. Michaels. We were wronged. Noah frowned. Wrong about what? Andrew spoke into his mobile. Everything. Andrew looked toward Tate. We couldn't have been more wrong, Dr. Michaels, if we hadn't had a clue what was going on. Andrew shook his head. We were looking in the wrong direction the whole fucking time. Talia's expression tightened. What does that mean? Noah asked. Andrew took a shaky breath. It means the variable you thought we were working with isn't the thing we're actually dealing with at all. Noah felt a chill run through him. Then what are we dealing with? Andrew looked at the garage where Tate was again. The worst possible scenario imaginable, doctor. He wiped the tears from his face. Andrew kept talking into the telephone. Dr. Michaels, we wondered who it was. His voice was unsteady. Like there was a single person, a single villain. He looked toward Tate lying on the garage floor, then closed his eyes for a moment. We couldn't be more wrong, it wasn't just one person. I know enough to say that we need professional help immediately for Tate. Tate remained silent. For once he didn't argue. He simply looked frightened. And that frightened Noah even more. Andrew suddenly burst into tears. Whatever he had experienced inside the garage had deeply troubled him. This wasn't ordinary fear or discomfort. Andrew looked completely overwhelmed, as though something he had witnessed had shattered his understanding of what was happening. Noah, Susie, and Talia exchanged uneasy glances. None of them wanted to ask what Andrew meant when he said that he and Dr. Michaels had been looking in the wrong direction. They were afraid of the answer. Andrew wiped at his face, but more tears followed. Noah watched him carefully. Andrew. Andrew shook his head. Not yet. His voice trembled. I can't explain it yet. And somehow, that was more frightening than anything else he could have said. Andrew stood by the garage, recovering from his nausea and what he had learned while helping Tate inside the garage not 10 minutes ago. Andrew kept talking on the phone with Dr. Michaels, his voice strained but deliberate. I knew the person. Tate lied so I'd never look in the right direction because he's ashamed of the truth and why it happened. I need you to be his psychologist, he said. If anyone can help him, it would be you. You did wonders for me. He glanced toward Tate, who was still lying on the garage floor. We need to control Tate's environment. Everything triggers him. There isn't anything or anyone that doesn't trigger Tate. Andrew swallowed hard. Every sound, every place, every person seems capable of pulling him somewhere else. I thought I understood what I was seeing, but I didn't. I was treating pieces of the puzzle without realizing there was an entire picture underneath them. He closed his eyes briefly. I need someone who can look at all of it without being emotionally tangled in it, and that person is you. Andrew looked over at Susie. Could you and Noah take Tate inside? I'm going to finish talking to the doctor and call for medical attention for Tate. I don't want him lying on this cold garage floor anymore. He needs to be somewhere safe until the doctors get here. Susie nodded immediately. Of course. She moved carefully toward Tate while Noah stayed close beside her. Tate, Susie said gently, lowering herself beside him, you're in the garage, you're safe. Noah is here with you. Noah crouched beside Tate, his voice soft. You're home, Tate, you're not alone. Tate's eyes moved slowly between them, still filled with confusion and fear. Susie and Noah carefully helped him orient himself to the garage, reminding him where he was and who they were. "You're safe," Noah repeated. "Just stay with us, Tate." Neither of them rushed him. They simply stayed beside him, giving him something familiar to hold onto while Andrew continued speaking with the doctor and arranged for medical help. Tate lied to everyone so Noah would never realize the truth. Noah would lose everything he holds dear if he knew what Tate kept from him. Tate paid Wayne so Noah could live his life without the burden of living the life Tate views as unbearable. Tate doesn't want to be Tatum Joseph Cornelius Blue because he had a secret no one knew but the men Tate became when he dissociated. Susie, Noah, and Talia were in the garage helping Tate. A few minutes later, Andrew ended the phone call. He stood silently for a moment, staring at the floor as memories began rushing through his mind. He remembered every conversation he and Tate had shared over the years, every late-night discussion, every confession, every secret Tate had trusted him with. Especially the conversations about the bashing. Tate had always insisted that it happened on his 15th birthday. Andrew had listened, he had asked questions, he had tried to understand what Tate remembered and what he couldn't. But now, standing in the garage, Andrew replayed those conversations differently. Every hesitation, every inconsistency, every time Tate had suddenly changed the subject. Andrew closed his eyes. How had he missed it? He had spent years listening to Tate tell him pieces of the story, believing he understood what Tate was describing. Now he wasn't so sure. Maybe the truth had been sitting in front of him the entire time. One thing Andrew knew without fail was that Tate had lied. Andrew knew that now, with a level of certainty that made his stomach turn every time he thought about it. Not suspicion. Not intuition. Andrew knew one thing for certain. Tate had lied to him while playing on Andrew's therapeutic sensitivities during their drive on South Vermont Avenue weeks earlier, while he and Tate spoke about the bashing Tate survived. Not psychological inference assembled carefully from fragmented behavior patterns and contradictions. Knowledge. Cold and absolute. The memory replayed in Andrew's mind constantly now, the drive to the blue warehouse, the rain hitting the windshield, Tate sitting rigid in the passenger seat like every muscle in his body had been wired too tightly. Andrew remembered how pale Tate had looked. How exhausted. How young. Tate had stared out the window for almost the entire drive before finally speaking in a voice so detached that Andrew had initially mistaken it for calm. "There was a teacher," Tate had said quietly. Andrew remembered gripping the steering wheel harder. At the time, he had believed he was listening to a trauma disclosure. Now he understood he had been listening to a constructed narrative assembled desperately around something worse to conceal the unimaginable. Tate had told him that years earlier when he was 15, a male straight teacher had tried to straighten out Tate. Tate had framed it carefully, not like a victim recounting confusion, but like someone trying to maintain moral structure around chaos. A homophobic man. A violent man. A man enraged by Tate's imagined impulses. A man who had interpreted perceived attraction as corruption and responded with brutality. Andrew remembered the exact phrasing because it had disturbed him even then. A righteous heterosexual rage, Tate had called it bitterly, staring straight ahead as if reading the words off the windshield itself. At the time, Andrew had thought the phrasing strange. Overly intellectualized. Like Tate was narrating the event instead of remembering it. But Tate had cried afterward. That was what convinced Andrew that Tate wasn't lying but telling him the truth. Not dramatic sobbing. Not collapse. Just silent tears slipping down Tate's face while he sat motionless in the passenger seat, trying unsuccessfully to stay composed. Andrew had pulled the car over. He remembered it vividly now. The dim industrial street. The smell of rain. The weak orange glow of distant parking lot lights reflected off wet pavement. Tate had leaned forward slightly, one hand covering his eyes as if ashamed to be seen unraveling. And Andrew. God. Andrew had put an arm around him. Andrew had let Tate bury his face against his shoulder while Andrew quietly assured him that none of what happened had been his fault. Andrew remembered feeling furious on Tate's behalf. Protective. Heartbroken. He remembered thinking. This explains so much. The hypervigilance. The dissociation. The panic around perceived homosexuality. The fractured sense of self. It had fit together too neatly. Too cleanly. Because it had not been the truth. That was the part Andrew could not forgive himself for now. Not merely believing Tate, but believing him because the lie had been psychologically convenient. The story had provided a framework Andrew understood. Victimization. Shame. Trauma. Repression. Those were categories Andrew could work with. Diagnose. Treat. Contain. But the real truth, whatever it actually was, had been buried underneath the narrative like something too dangerous to touch directly. What bullshit? Tate was lying not about the gay hate crime but about who did it and why. It wasn't just one gay hate crime but two that happened by the same man on Tate's 15th and 25th birthdays. The seizure incident today and at the cafe when Andrew and Talia had called 911 was about the warehouse incident and how Tate was triggered by Wayne and old trucks. The perpetrator of the hate crimes wasn't a heterosexual male teacher full of righteous anger trying to fix a gay teen like Tate, but Tate's godfather and a man everyone who knew Noah trusted. This basher was someone Andrew had met many times at the Blue family home, a former secret lover of Tate's, a trusted male member of Talia's inner circle, a nice guy who was a business associate, Tate's power of attorney and godfather. The motive for the hate crime wasn't to straighten out Tate because he was gay, but because the jealous basher was in love with Tate, and Noah was in the rival's way by being in Tate's bed. Tate was bashed because his enraged ex-lover was insanely angry due to sexual jealousy, loss of proximity to Tate's body at night, loss of exclusive hookups outside the Blue house, and the emotional closeness they once shared before Noah ruined everything. Andrew's thoughts returned to the person Tate had always called his basher. He had once imagined the man as someone driven simply by hatred or cruelty, but the pieces Tate had revealed suggested something more complicated and far more disturbing. The man had been jealous. Desperately, obsessively jealous. He had become terrified that Tate was giving his heart, attention, body, and loyalty to someone else after believing he had possessed those things for himself since Tate was a child. And Noah had become the center of that jealousy. The basher seemed consumed by the idea that Noah had taken Tate away from him. His fixation had grown so extreme that Andrew suspected he would do almost anything to punish Tate for choosing Noah, even if that meant deliberately terrifying Noah. Andrew felt sick thinking about it. The bashing hadn't necessarily been about Tate alone. Noah may have been part of the reason the violence had happened at all. Andrew understood that now. Tate had not lied casually. He had lied structurally, but to hide a deadly, shameful, and unspeakable truth. Tate had never had a stalker at his high school. In fact, the story he had told everyone wasn't true. Tate had never had 3 stalkers. The female teacher he claimed had stalked him, the teacher who supposedly tried to enter the shower while he was in high school and later threatened a murder-suicide, had never existed. There was no record of her. No teacher matching the description. No incident. Nothing. The story Tate had told so convincingly had simply never happened the way Tate swore it did. The fake teacher had not existed to deceive Andrew for amusement or manipulation. The teacher existed because Tate's mind and Andrew's ideals required a morally comprehensible monster. Someone external. Someone simple. Someone Andrew could hate safely. Because the real story was tangled somewhere far deeper inside Tate's psychological architecture, inside the same collapsing structure Andrew had only recently begun to understand. There had never been a teacher, a female or male stalker who had been a teacher at the high school Tate had attended. Tate had had sex with many female teachers, that was true, but no one had ever stalked Tate from the outside world. Tate had lied to Andrew and to Noah, specifically to Noah. Tate had told Noah that there had been a female unhinged teacher who had stalked him for years during and after high school. That was a bald-faced lie. Tate's female stalker from school, Tate's basher, definitely not Noah, Tate's fiancé, Tate's lovers, Tate's childhood sweetheart, the future Mrs. Tate Blue, the only man Tate had ever slept with, Jay, who wrote love letters to Tate, and the man who told Tate to seek out another boy in preschool and bring him home. Were all the same jealous ex-lover and man who wouldn't let Tate go even 12 years after their breakup. They had never been different people. They had been different names, different stories, different identities used at different points in Tate's life, but underneath all of them was the same person. The reason Tate had so many supposed lovers was beginning to make sense. They were camouflage, a smoke screen to hide the relationship. Even Noah and his relationship with Tate for 22 years before Chloe entered their lives was a smokescreen to hide and protect Tate's relationship with Jay. Tate had deliberately created the appearance of having a complicated romantic history because he needed to hide one very specific lover, the one person he absolutely did not want anyone to identify. That man was the person who kept calling Tate's house. The calls had terrified Noah. Sometimes the caller named Jay would be drinking. Sometimes there would be strange, creepy sounds in the background. Sometimes the caller would say almost nothing at all, leaving Noah to listen to the unsettling noises on the other end of the line. And because so many people supposedly called Tate, nobody immediately questioned it. That was the point. If 10, 20, or 30 different people could potentially be calling the house, one particular caller didn't stand out. Nobody would think, why does this person keep calling Tate? Nobody would wonder why Tate sometimes became distant or agitated after certain calls. Nobody would realize that all those different names were creating a smokescreen around one particular man. Even the letter Chloe had read to her girlfriends suddenly made sense. The letter had been written by Tate's basher and ex-lover, Jay. The handwriting, the language, the details, it all pointed back to the same person. The truth went back much further than anyone had realized. When Tate was 13, a police captain had visited his junior high class to talk about stranger danger and, more importantly, the grooming of children. The captain explained the different ways grooming could happen and why predators did it. He talked about manipulation, secrecy, gifts, isolation, and convincing a child that an inappropriate relationship was somehow special or loving. Tate had sat there listening. And then the examples began sounding far too familiar. The relationship he had with Jay, his godfather since he was 4, a man a decade older than him, was being described in terms Tate had never been willing to use himself. Dangerous. Predatory. Illegal. Tate's stomach twisted. He had always believed Jay loved him. Jay had convinced him that their relationship was consensual, that it was something special, and that Jay was protecting him from bullies. But sitting in that classroom, Tate began to understand that none of those explanations changed the reality. Tate had been a child. Consent could not exist in a relationship where one person was a minor and the other was an adult. The realization hit him so hard that he could barely breathe. Tate ended his relationship with his fiancée. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that Jay hadn't been protecting him at all. He had been grooming him. Tate suddenly raised his hand and told the teacher he thought he was having a nosebleed. It wasn't a nosebleed. Tate had jammed his finger up his nose to create one so he would have an excuse to leave class. He just needed to get out of that classroom. He hurried toward the nurse's office, but he probably never made it that far. He likely stopped in the bathroom and vomited instead, overwhelmed by the horrifying realization that the person he had trusted for years had been preying on him. Tate hurt gay people because in his mind, any male physical attraction towards another male minor was too similar to his memories of child molestation. Tate's situation with Jay was unlike anything Andrew had ever encountered in his years as a clinician and as a survivor of CSA himself. And the realization was devastating because Andrew had lived through childhood abuse himself. He knew what grooming could look like. He knew how complicated loyalty, fear, affection, and confusion could become when an adult had manipulated a child. Yet somehow, he had never put the pieces together when it came to Tate. Jay hadn't simply been a mere teacher who hurt Tate. No, it was someone everyone who knew Noah trusted. He had been a family friend, Tate's power of attorney, his guardian, his godfather, the man who had named Tate and held him moments after he was born. Jay had been woven into Tate's life from the very beginning. And Tate had worshipped him. As a young boy, Tate had looked at Jay almost as though he were looking at God himself, the one person he believed could protect him, understand him, and make the world feel safe. For years, Tate had believed Jay was the only genuinely kind person he had ever known. Until Noah came into his life. Noah had become another person who cared about Tate, listened to him, and knew the secrets Tate had spent years hiding from everyone else. Andrew stared at Tate, his heart breaking as the pieces finally connected. Tate hadn't simply trusted Jay. He had been taught to trust him. And that distinction changed everything. Jay's bedroom had been the only place Tate remembered as truly safe when he was growing up. It had been a refuge from the darkness, from the bullies, and from the violence that seemed to follow him everywhere. For the first few years of his life, Tate had been terrified of the dark, but Andrew now wondered if Tate had ever really been afraid of the darkness itself. Maybe he had been afraid Jay wouldn't be there. Whenever the fear became too much, Tate would run down the hallway of the blue house and hide in Jay's bedroom. Jay would pull him close and curl protectively around him, convincing Tate that nothing could reach him there. No bully was supposed to enter Jay's room. The Blue House in NYC was hardly a sanctuary. It was practically a train station for wealthy and politically connected people. Important guests came and went constantly. People stayed overnight, and not everyone who entered that house was kind to Tate. Some of them bullied him. Some of them frightened him. And Tate had learned that the only place he could retreat was Jay's bedroom. Andrew's stomach turned as another piece of the puzzle fell into place. The personality Tate had become terrified of during his dissociative episodes, the one associated with the gun pressed against Noah's head while Tate was dissociating in the shower and Noah was hiding beneath the bed, wasn't entirely new. It was the same kind of threat Jay had protected Tate from for years, before Noah ever entered Tate's life. And in some ways, even after Noah became part of it. Tate had spent his childhood believing Jay was the person standing between him and the monsters he met in NYC. Andrew now wondered what it meant that Jay had also been the person Tate trusted most. Tate's love for Jay had begun as something unnaturally natural. There was nothing strange about a child loving his godfather. Tate had loved Jay as an extension of his own family, who didn't love their godfather, who didn't wait by the window for him to arrive with gifts, who didn't kiss him on the cheek or climb into his lap as a child. The natural part was that it never stopped there. Tate had taken Jay's protective, affectionate nature and turned it into an oasis, a safe place to land whenever the rest of his world became unbearable. Maybe at first Jay hadn't even understood what he was doing was wrong. Andrew struggled with that possibility. A teenager would eventually understand that something was wrong, but Tate and Jay had grown up in an environment where the normal boundaries of morality had been distorted beyond recognition. They had no healthy example to teach them where affection ended and exploitation began. That wasn't an excuse, but it might explain why Jay seemed to have such a distorted relationship with morality. Their relationship had become a coping mechanism built around shared trauma. They had both been hurt by the same people, they both knew what had happened to the other. They both carried knowledge about the Blue household that neither of them could safely share with anyone else. They knew things even Wayne hadn't fully understood about himself. In that house, Tate and Jay may have been the only two people who knew.